Welcome everyone to this very important discussion regarding the applicability of cooperative business models in the human services industry. I'd like to also begin with acknowledging that the land we meet on today are the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still important to the living Kaurna people today. As industries transform to meet new market requirements, different business models emerge. The disability and wider human services industry is no different. Certainly, the historical business models in the disability sector are being challenged and are perhaps no longer fit for purpose. Many disability service providers are collaborating on their transformation journeys as we speak. They are seeking to learn from one another as they introduce new processes, systems, in order to be successful for the future. Learn how to work in an NDIS environment where winning in a competitive market is now important. Put simply, service providers are learning how to operate in a commercial and competitive world. With innovation and technology impacting all industries, we are seeing a trend to increased automation and data exchange, commonly known as Industry 4.0, and David touched on this. The challenge for disability service providers is that they are not only need to meet and to operate in the basics of a competitive commercial environment, something new to them, but they also need to consider the impacts and possibilities of Industry 4.0. All of this requires the capability and capacity to increase in the development of the business and its people. Another area where disability service providers are constrained from both the history of thin balance sheets and NDIS pricing, and the NDIS pricing arguably doesn't provide the sufficient scope for innovation and investment. And maybe the arguably bit is a little bit too nice, being too nice to it. I think there isn't enough scope for innovation and investment in the NDIS pricing as we speak. So continued collaboration is an essential ingredient to allow service providers to develop and grow. This year, we'll see the establishment of a collaboration centre, something industry identified in Shaping the Future forum late last year. This centre will initially focus on areas of practice, technology, both internal technology to the business and assistive technologies, leadership and learning and employment. And it will also have an important research component to consider future directions, including Industry 4.0 considerations, which might get to 4.7. Some service providers have taken the step to move their collaborations to a more formal place, with a number of mergers occurring across Australia and, dare I say it, in South Australia as well. These mergers are a direct response to new market dynamics and, in some cases, the need to establish scale. Consolidation is beginning in the disability sector, something that has already been occurring in other industries for some time, and in particular the aged care sector of more recent times. There is a recognition that scale does matter, but of course, as David put it, all three forms of scale is critical. So if consolidation is represented by perhaps two ends of a spectrum, with collaboration at one end, where capability and scale is achieved by working together, and merger perhaps, where organisations morph into one, sits at the other end of that scale, what might sit in between? Well, cooperatives arguably might sit in between those two extremes. More formal and legally binding than simply collaborating, yet arguably more flexible than a merger. There are many global examples of cooperatives, including in the human services area, and you'll hear about many of those today, which is very exciting. In creating today's forum, it struck me that a cooperative business model may well be suited to the transforming disability sector. You might ask why. Well, firstly, because individual providers are keen to retain their individual identities, born from long histories and a sense of purpose. And secondly, they continue to search for the capability and scale necessary to compete in the future in a cap price competitive retail market. Whether they need to reduce overheads, meet new consumer requirements or innovate more broadly, There is a need to identify the business models that respond to market pressures and support growth. So, does a cooperative business model provide this? Well, I believe an interesting example, perhaps in the non-human services area, is the One World Alliance of airlines. In that alliance, if you were to book a flight from Adelaide to London today with Qantas, you may well travel with another airline. An example of front office or customer sharing. However, if you were to fly Qantas and stopped in Singapore, the plane would be replenished by a non-Qantas provider. An example of back office sharing. The One World Alliance website describes how that alliance model works for them and the benefits to the consumer of global coverage, better value, more rewards, superior quality, greater support, just to name a few. There have been a lot of conversations recently regarding back office shared services between disability service providers, and whilst it is a legitimate and genuine opportunity to be pursued, I think the much more strategic opportunity exists in the front of office services areas, where demand will outstrip supply in the short term, and the services demand will continue to evolve as consumers look for new and broader services. One World is just one example of a cooperative business model. There are many variations, including, dare I say it, consumer cooperatives. Now there's an interesting idea for the disability sector. Whilst co-ops are not necessarily an appropriate business model for everyone, they do at least deserve to be considered. At a recent thin market ideation workshop, which we held in Riverland-Murraylands region this month, the idea of establishing a cooperative of providers was raised by workshop participants and is now being investigated. But perhaps that's something that's natural for a Riverland community with a long history of co-ops. The critical point, though, is that the assessment must take into account the market drivers and pressures impacting the business and how well and in what form a cooperative business model will address these drivers. I'm looking forward to today's forum, and in particular, the possibility that we might see cooperatives as part of the human services industry landscape in South Australia. Thank you for being here today.